Hello everybody, welcome back to Daisy Asks, a channel where we like to discuss the Delphi case, to synthesize and integrate all the information that we can find publicly and make sense of it. And today I'm back to the phone data. Now, just a little bit of a intro here. This is a pre-recorded video. I'm trying to do a few pre-recorded videos because the time zone stuff is really messing with my sleep. And so I thought it would be better if I recorded the videos and then put them out as premieres or lives where everyone's welcome to come in and chat at a time that's probably more suitable for you guys, which means I may or may not be in the chat, but I'm always going to have a look after the fact at what's happened in the chat and also in the comments. So please feel free to share your ideas, your thoughts, and also discuss amongst yourselves. Now I am back to the phone data again, but today's video is more a summary video. So we're not going to be bringing up anything particularly new in today's video, but it is a summary of a lot of information that I've been discussing over the last few weeks. So I've obsessively kind of deep dived into the KnowledgeC data in particular, and had lots of hypotheses, lots of different ideas around this. And I feel like now I'm at a point where I'm quite confident in a lot of the hypotheses that I have and a lot of the information that I've gathered, both from looking at the data and considering it from, I guess, a perspective of research, logic, science, behavior, and all of the above. Now, as I always do, I want to remind you guys that the reason we're doing this is for these two girls who face an untimely and horrendous fate. And I always want to keep them front and center, and particularly when we're discussing Libby's phone and the final hours of these beautiful girls' lives. It's so important to me to always remember that their legacy is what is most important. Now, of course, anyone who watches my channel knows that I strongly believe that Richard Allen is not the offender of this horrendous crime. And so I also have him front and center of my thoughts when I discuss the information about this case. The other key thing that I always like to remind everybody of is the disclaimer here. I love to synthesize and research and understand this data, but this is purely my own research. It's for educational and discussion purposes only. And even when I say educational, I say it loosely because I am not an expert in this area, and therefore I do not expect that I'm educating others about it. All I'm doing is synthesizing all the research and information that I've looked at into things that I believe are easy to digest and putting some of my hypotheses out there. I'm pretty confident in my analysis of this data because I've been doing it for weeks. But of course, there's always room for error, and you're absolutely welcome to point out any errors or any misinformation that is in my slides or in this video. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal professional, I'm certainly not a digital forensics expert. Everything that I have gleaned about this has come from research I've done online, and I always use full disclosure that I definitely use a lot of AI to make sense of complicated things. Nothing here should be taken as legal advice. It's my own personal opinion and interpretation of publicly available information. So I don't have any information that anybody else doesn't freely have either. Everything that I obtain is from Twitter, from the All Eyes on Delphi GitHub, and from things that are available widely online. And if I do mention any individuals in the presentations, they are all presumed innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. And yeah, this isn't an expert opinion. This is just the thoughts of an interested person on the other side of the world. So as I said, today's video is going over old ground if you've been watching my lives over the last few weeks, but hopefully just consolidating it all. I've seen a lot of people discussing the KnowledgeC data, the phone, the movements of the girls, not just recently, but over time. And there are so many different ideas that show up. And I'm not here to say that any idea is completely wrong or completely right, but I am confident of the analysis that I've done. And I am confident that it helps us to make sense of what happened to that phone and a little bit more about what happened to the girls. Now, a lot of my observations don't marry up with the state's theory or the defense's theory. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm on the state side or not on the defense's side. It just means that I'm following the data and looking at what makes most sense. So anyone who knows me knows that I am very much staunchly advocating for Richard Allen. However, I will always do that with integrity, and that is looking at the data and seeing what there is to see rather than trying to confirm or disconfirm things that I like or don't like. Now, I don't think that any of my analysis of this data is negative when it comes to Richard Allen's defense. It's just that it doesn't support one of the, or at least some of the defense arguments. I think one, really, it's just the headphone thing. And I don't think that that's a pivotal, important point of the defense for Richard Allen. I mean, after all, that point did not seem to play out and provide the outcome that was desired in the trial. And therefore, I don't think it's an angle that is going to necessarily be particularly relevant and important for any subsequent legal proceedings. I think there's so much more evidence that is more helpful to Rick Allen's defense than the headphones in and out. But yeah, so just want to know, I just want people to know that in debunking the headphones, it doesn't mean I'm trying to debunk Rick Allen's defense. I believe staunchly that Rick Allen is innocent, and I believe that there are so many other arguments that can be put forward. Also, not dismissing the defense at all, I think that hindsight is 2020, and I think that with all of the additional information that's been released, there are other angles that can be explored, but I'm really mindful that the defense did the very best they could with the information they had and the resources they had at the time. Okay, so the main point that I feel I've lingered on when it comes to the phone data has been the thermal shock timeline. And I'm really confident in this analysis of the data. There are a few variations that I'm willing to explore as well, but essentially, what is the thermal shock timeline? The thermal shock timeline is basically an explanation of why that phone appears to have this oddity in terms of a battery drop and movement stopping all around the same point, which is 2:18 p.m. So I believe that in that time frame between the bridge guy video and 2:18 p.m, the girls do, of course, go down the hill. We see Abby already moving to do that. Have a little theory there too, which will come up when I give, I guess, my final hypothesis of the bridge guy video. But I believe actually the girls are trying to escape at that point. They've waited, they've considered how dangerous it is. And when he says down the hill, I wonder if they just slide down the hill immediately to try and escape and evade bridge guy. I'll go more into that in a subsequent video, but I do believe they go down the hill, and I believe that within that 4 minutes, for whatever reason, they end up at the water's edge. Now, whether that's because they try to run away and go to the water, or whether that's because they're caught and directed there, whether there's somebody else down the hill that directs them there, I don't know, and I guess none of us know unless the offender is willing to share that detail. But what I do think happens is that that phone is met with a splash, at least, of cold water at 2:18 p.m. Now, when I say a splash of cold water, I don't mean that the phone is submerged. I don't believe that the phone has any extensive, I guess, exposure to water, because we know there is no water damage that is shown on the iPhone. Now, that doesn't mean that the iPhone hasn't had any contact with water. It just means that the water hasn't reached that sort of internal space. And this is where I'm not going to sound technical at all, but it doesn't reach the part that indicates water damage. But I do believe that it's more the cold rather than the water that affects the battery so significantly and the motion sensors. We see that the motion sensor data returns again at 2:25, so after a 7-minute pause, and this suggests maybe the phone stabilizes again. And I wonder whether this is the warmth of the hand, the arm, the clothing, that kind of gets the temperature back up to a point where the phone is able to kind of start to have some more activity again in terms of motion. Now, we know that the last meaningful phone activity is logged at 2:44 p.m. I do believe that that is the point at which the phone is underneath, potentially underneath Abby's body, but it's certainly the point at which the phone drops into that space. And we know, or I believe, that after that, it remains active for about 3 hours. I believe that the temperature remains warm under the body, and then at some point, of course, the body cools. And again, I always mention I hate speaking about the girls' bodies in this way, in such a clinical cold way, but I believe that, of course, the temperature would drop, and that really maps well onto what I see as the phone dying essentially at 5:45 p.m. Now, the reason I believe the phone dies at that point is that we don't see any more screen on, screen off. All we see is idle tower pings do continue through the night. That's part of the tower information from AT&T. And we do see missed calls, text messages, which I believe may be artifacts. And what I mean by that is that when the phone comes back on the next day, or the day after, in the lab, in the police headquarters, wherever it's being held, that the phone, the KnowledgeC, updates with all of the stuff that came in through the server. Again, not super technical there. It's coming up a bit later in the slides, but I think you get the overall gist. So my interpretation is that this is to do with thermal shock and body warmth patterns that match cold exposure, and not necessarily, of course, continued use. I don't believe that the phone is ever used specifically by the user again after the bridge guy video and maybe the attempt for somebody to log in that's failed. Now, another possibility for the thermal shock timeline is that the phone is simply dropped to the ground. It is not being held. That would be another explanation for the temperature drop and the battery drop, because of course it's very cold out there in Delphi, and even if it didn't touch cold water, touching the cold ground, not being held by a human, and the warmth of a human could impact it too. The reason I think that the water is a more logical hypothesis is probably because we see screen on, screen off events between 2:18 and 2:25, suggesting that the phone is still being interacted with in a passive way, like, you know, jolted or water droplets on the screen that kind of make the screen on and off. I think that there's something still going on, which I don't think would happen if the phone was simply dropped and left on the ground. But also, it doesn't seem plausible to me that the phone is dropped and then picked up 7 minutes later. Now, I'm willing to admit that I'm probably more biased towards the water theory because it totally debunks the white van theory. Not that we needed any more debunking. So I think I probably lean more there, but I also think logically it leans more there. The alternative of it being dropped, perhaps because the girls were, I don't know, forced to undress or do something else, is possible, but I don't think it's as, it offers as clear an explanation as the walking across the creek water theory. Now, again, I think either of those is possible. I think that the subsequent wake up and movement again could be the elevation of the creek bed, of climbing back up, or it could also be an artifact of, you know, the phone sensors being all over the place because of the damage or the impact of the cold. The second thing that I've spoken about before is the Instagram photos, the one of the trunk, the tree limb, and the one of the bridge and the Deer Creek view over the bridge. Now, I truly believe that these are photos potentially from Bree Wilbur, from her Instagram, either a story or on her feed. They marry up so well with the Snapchat activity between Libby, well, from Libby in the car, which I believe is between her and Bree Wilbur. It makes sense with the timing. And I believe, she's talking to Brie Wilbur and saying, are you guys still there? And at the same time, she's looking at Instagram and seeing Brie Wilbur's photos. It makes a lot of sense because those photos really marry up with Brie Wilbur's movements that day of going to the bridge, up to the first trestle. That view is from around the first trestle and then underneath the bridge and that tree limb by the water's edge. So why do I think those two images are in Libby's Instagram cache? Well, I don't think it's anything suspicious. I think we know that she does certainly access Instagram around that time. And then those images are timestamped 141, which would have been around the time that she was having a bit of back and forth with Brie Wilbur. And they would have been some of the newest images on Instagram because we know that Brie Wilbur and her group had only left the bridge, a matter of maybe half an hour earlier, or maybe even less. And so those would have been quite recent stories. She may have even done them from the bench, like the timestamp on pictures on Snapchat or Instagram aren't necessarily the time that the photos are taken, they're the time that those photos are uploaded. So to me, the cached Instagram images that are timestamped around 1:41 p.m. align with user interaction, not a background sync. However, when I say user interaction, I mean logging in and looking at your Instagram, not getting a message in with those, not saving those. But the stored cache images occur when someone scrolls the feed or views stories. It's not to do with a direct message necessarily. So my overall understanding is this wasn't a push notification or passive background activity. The pattern matches manual engagement, but most likely a quick story view or feed scroll, both of which would prompt image caching. And these would be the most recent images because she doesn't really have any ongoing interaction. I believe maybe she opens Instagram one further time very briefly, but these would be the most recent images. And so I think, again, it's not suspicious. I think she was talking to Brie Wilbur. She potentially looked on Instagram to see what Brie Wilbur had been doing. I'd be curious to know the content of the snap messages between them. It may even be that Brie said, oh, yeah, we were just there. We took some cool photos. That's just obviously speculation. And in looking at a story or a feed, particularly a story, that's what I really feel is going on here. Those pictures are kind of stored in the cache, at least temporarily. And they're not necessarily cleared if there isn't any other significant interaction with that app. Okay, the next one is the headphones. I strongly believe that the audio route change has got nothing to do with headphones. And I know that's a strong position to take because it goes against the defense expert, Stacey Eldridge. The reason I think that is because when you look at the pattern of data over the course of the few days of KnowledgeC data that we have for Libby's phone, we see that audio output route change multiple times. And it always coincides with something in the system that requires audio, whether that be Siri, whether that be a video being processed after it's taken, like the Bridge Guy video, whether it be a voicemail, which is what we see in the case of the 544 log. Now, bearing in mind that I think that the phone essentially dies at 5:45, then we can see that that later log of, I think it's 10 something, is maybe again a system artifact. When the phone turns back on, it updates all the things that it didn't get to finish before it died, if that makes sense, or that happened after it died. So to me, the most likely explanation is voicemail handling when it comes to the 544 entry. If you look at the KnowledgeC data carefully, you will see that that is the point at which the only voicemail that is actually a voicemail, because the rest are 000, the only voicemail that is actually processed by the phone comes in at around the same time, just prior. Now, I believe that's Derek German's voicemail, and that explains why that one actually has a few seconds to it versus the others that are all 000. I believe that's when the phone was still able to, I suppose, receive the voicemail. I don't know if that's the right term, but I think that was when there was still a capacity for voicemail to be sent, because all subsequent voicemail messages that are logged in KnowledgeC are 0. You'll also notice that voicemail comes in from an unknown number. That's not an unknown number. That is the number of the provider for voicemail. Now, I can't remember if it's Verizon or AT&T, but it absolutely matches that. So I don't know if any of you guys have ever had this, but I know I have. I don't have voicemail on my phone now, but in the past, what would happen is that you would get a call back from voicemail, and that would indicate that you had a voicemail from whoever it was that had sent it. So I think that's what that number is. I searched it and it was consistent with that. It's not an unknown number, which is why, again, it's not suspicious. But I think it is the reason for the audio route change. The same way that the one after the bridge guy video, as the girls are sliding down the hill, is not headphones being inserted, because that would be pretty bizarre, I think, when the phone's potentially concealed and they're running for their life or, slipping down a hill. I think that is the post-video processing, which is quite a common thing to happen as far as I'm aware when it comes to iPhones. So it reflects automatic system behavior, not physical headphone use. And I know it's a bold statement to go against Stacey Eldridge, but I think that Apple doesn't necessarily release what code 1 equals as far as I'm aware. But when you look at this, people infer it. And yes, one inference could be headphones. But when you look at the data across the days, you'll see that the audio output route changes always co-occur with something involving audio in the system, including, like I said, Siri and voicemail and video processing. So there's a little bit more technical stuff here. So it can track any change in audio output. So switching from speaker to receiver, system default route fallback. So if there's no output available, activation of voicemail audio playback, video audio processing, e.g. post-recording, device recovery or reboot. Now, I know when you read that, you might say, but the voicemail wouldn't have been playing back. I don't think it needs to be playing back externally, but it could be processing it internally, if that makes sense. So just like the bridge guy video, it wasn't playing when we see the audio output after it ends, but it's an internal audio process. So it does not automatically mean headphones, that the user made a choice, or that the audio was played audibly at all. Now, another thing I've heard thrown around a lot is the Faraday bag aspect, and I've called it the Faraday bag fallacy here. I didn't know what a Faraday bag was, but I've looked into it now and understood it better. But here's why I don't think it's relevant in this case, because this phone continues to ping Wells Tower. Now, there's 2 time points there, but we know that it pings throughout the night. There is no tower log that shows that the phone was pinging anywhere else, but it was pinging. It doesn't go black. Now, a true Faraday bag would block all tower signals. That's the whole point of it. I think it blocks anyone from being able to detect that device. So we know that this phone keeps pinging the same coordinates throughout the night. So it really does not support a Faraday bag or movement theories. That phone was not pinging all around Delphi. It was not pinging at the high school. It was pinging in the very same spot from the Wells Tower over and over again. Another thing that's important to recognize is that reboots trigger artifacts. So we talked about this a bit before. So forensic imaging can generate what we say is misleading logs. Now, they're not misleading in that they're generating things that didn't actually happen, but what it is doing is it's generating it after the fact. So the phone was accessed by law enforcement the next day or maybe perhaps the day after, and screen-on events, audio routing logs can stem from the device waking up, from a boot loop, or from forensic imaging tools. Now, I don't fully understand that, but what I think it's trying to say here, as you know, I do get AI to help me with my slides sometimes, particularly the technical stuff. But what it's trying to say here is I actually think the screen on and off, actually, I'd probably take that off this slide. I do believe that they are accurate. They don't have these post hoc screen on and off events when the phone is off, hence why I think the phone is off at 5:45 or essentially dead in a deep sleep. But what does happen is that old logs, I suppose, of texts or calls that were received, or the audio output, stopping again, that have happened after the phone is in that deep sleep, sort of dead state, can now be updated and put into the timeline of the phone after the fact. So it looks as though they were all happening on the phone that night, but the phone was off or in a deep sleep. So it kind of is updating it after the fact. I'm trying to think of like a concrete example of this. But yeah, it's sort of like a post hoc log. So the reminder here is that forensic artifacts don't equal proof of life. So just because calls were received or audio output changed, that does not mean that the phone was alive at that point, nor does it mean that anyone was interacting with it. Now, another thing that's been a query of mine and others is, why does KnowledgeC not say that the phone powered off? Well, apparently no shutdown logs do appear in KnowledgeC. So KnowledgeC logs screen app usage, not power state. So it does log battery power, but not whether it's on or off. iOS shutdown logs are rarely extracted or persist, particularly, I believe, if the phone is turned on and off again, it loses that data. I think we heard that when it came to Cecil's testimony or Bunner's, but sudden log cessation doesn't necessarily does equal a shutdown, not necessarily an anomaly. And so again, this maps with my 545 kind of phone death hypothesis. So it's not suspicious that the phone never says it went off. That isn't actually apparently a routine thing that would show on the KnowledgeC log. Now, temperature logs, again, a really relevant piece of information if we were able to get it, because it could confirm or disconfirm the cold shock kind of theory that I've been floating. But unfortunately, iOS does not store persistent thermal logs. Volatile temperature data is lost on reboot or OS update. So again, this is another piece of information that's lost once they're rebooting the phone. And 8 years later, nothing would remain. It wouldn't be recoverable. So I don't believe there's a current method to retrieve historic temperature logs from the iPhone. Such a shame, because I think if there were, it may help us to confirm the cold shock idea or disconfirm it. I'm open to that, but I think that it would most likely confirm it. So I've already said I think that the phone likely died at 5:45 p.m. The reason for that being that the final screen off event is at 5:45 p.m. and we don't see anything subsequently. The only thing we see are voicemails and tower pings, which occur passively, and they don't require the phone to be powered on in its full state. It can be in a deep sleep, sort of frozen death state of a phone, I suppose. iOS logs screen events with high reliability, as I mentioned before, so the total absence of any further screen on and offs after 5:45 strongly indicates the phone shut down due to battery loss or thermal failure. So here's just a few myths that I've probably already addressed, but let's just go over them again, because these are things that persist in the community. And I mean, they're things that I believed, but then I couldn't find any factual basis for them. And one of them is, I believe that this is Mike Paddy says this in an interview. The phone was pinging all around town. And I believe I've heard other people say it pinged at the Delphi High School. Why would that be? I can't see anything in the official trial exhibits or testimony that suggests that. And the reality is that the information that we see, the phone pings and the coordinates on the KnowledgeC data, actually are very much consistent with the phone not moving from 2:44 p.m. onwards, and the coordinates before the abduction are all consistent with the girls' known movements. They show the girls literally traveling from the Paddy's house all the way to the bridge, to the trails, walking up to the bridge. And I know there's been some talk about the coordinate around the time of the bridge guy video looking like it's off the bridge and down the other side of the hill. But realistically, we've got to remember that there's a 30-meter kind of reliability of that. So there's a 30-meter range for that. So the end of the bridge where Libby is standing, where she's taking the bridge guy video, is within 30 meters of that coordinate. So I think it's just about there being a wider range of what's the word? I can't think of the word, but it's, yeah, the accuracy of the range is a little bit less there because previously it's 5 meters. And that's probably because of, where they're at. They're more likely to be the area is more wooded, the reception might be poorer. And so there's a greater range of error, I suppose, in terms of the coordinates, but it's not grossly out of the ordinary. It's not like the coordinate is way off the Monon High Bridge. It's literally within 30 meters of where Libby would be standing as she's taking that video. I've already explained the Faraday bag myth. The reality is that if there were a Faraday bag being used, then the phone would not continue to ping a nearby tower. Talked as well about the phone kept moving later in the day or later after the 2:44. There is just no evidence of that. The phone remains in a static location according to the pings of the tower. And according to the KnowledgeC data, there is no further movement. Now, the movement sensors could have been damaged or problematic because of the thermal shock that we've discussed. However, it just appears as though that phone lays in the same place, and that is the crime scene where the girls ultimately were found. So that's all for now. That is me consolidating all the key things that I found from the KnowledgeC data set. I'm, as I said, fairly confident in a lot of the conclusions that I've come to about this, and that's because I've really dug and explored and gone down various different paths with this. And anyone who's watched all my videos will see there's been an evolution of these ideas over time. But one of the things, or the things that have stuck, are a lot of the things that have been presented here in this summary presentation. So nice short presentation. So for anyone who doesn't want to go into all the technical stuff, this is your go-to place to synthesize all of that. But if you do want to dig into any of those points further, definitely look at my series of videos. There is some evolution along the way, so you may hear some things that I've subsequently debunked my own ideas. For example, there was a point which I wasn't sure if the girls had crossed the creek, but I do believe they did. And I do believe that matches this cold shock theory. I really believe that the girls hit the water within a few minutes of the Bridge Sky video. I think that the vast majority of this crime occurred over the creek at the crime scene. And hence, I do still believe it debunks the white van theory, along with so many other things that debunk it. So it certainly doesn't hinge on this to be debunked. I think that the crime, or the girls had been mortally wounded well before Brad Weber drove past, or at least were at the crime scene and in the midst of that as Brad Weber drove past. So very much inconsistent with Rick's confession, and I say that in quotation marks, to Walla, very much inconsistent with the state's timeline and narrative. So, yeah, I guess that's all for now. There will be more videos on other stuff now. I'm probably going to leave the KnowledgeC data to the side for a while unless anybody has any questions or comments or critiques that they'd like me to discuss. I'm happy to hop back on and do that. But yeah, I hope that provides a good summary for people who don't want to spend the hours that I have spent looking at it, re-looking at it, researching. It was interesting for me. I'm a bit of a stats and data person, but it's certainly not my area of expertise. Also, sorry if I butchered any of the digital information. All the best, guys. I'll speak to you soon. Bye.